radio dispatch immediately?
Yes.
Are there certain circumstances or situations where you may get a phone call or a report of a use of force within 10 to 15 minutes?
Yes.
Are there circumstances where you may get a use of force report or from an officer from an hour or two later?
Not one that would cause me to have to go to the scene. That would be more immediate. They'd want to let me know right away because I need to get out there and interview the subject.
Right. But it could happen within more than, say, 10, 15, 20 minutes that you get that notification.
Yes.
It would be fair to say that in certain types of use of force, there may be other, or use of force cases, there may be other activities that the officer needs to do after the use of force. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So they may use force against suspect number one, but then they have to apprehend suspect number two, for example, right?
Yes.
And they've used force on number one, but they get number two detained and it takes some time, then they caught him, right?
Yes.
Or, for example, an officer may use force on someone, conduct some additional investigation, whether it be interviewing witnesses or gathering evidence, and then call you to report the use of force, right?
Yes.
Is there a policy within the Minneapolis Police Department that requires an officer who uses force to do that through dispatch channels?
No.
They could call you on your cell phone.
Yes.
They could send you a text.
Yes.
Basically, their requirement is that they need to reach out to you and say, hey, we need you to come to the scene, right? We use force. Now,
but he didn't do that. Someone else called you, and then you had to call him because he didn't pick up the phone to call you.
just a second. I'm showing you Exhibit 221. Policy 5-306 regarding medical assistance. What do the first four words after medical assistance read?
As soon as reasonably.
Practical, right? Oh,
Yeah,
that's
fine.
four. Sorry, you got me. As soon as reasonably practical, right?
Correct.
An officer has to use or render medical assistance as soon as is reasonably practical, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar generally with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical decision-making model?
Somewhat.
Essentially, when a police officer is engaged in a situation, would you agree that an officer is constantly taking in new information, processing that information, comparing it to what happened before, and making decisions based on information as it comes in?
Yes.
And information as an officer is dealing with the situation can change, right?
Yes.
And that information that they take in may change or modify the behavior in response to the situation, right?
Yes.
So for example, sometimes an officer may decide to use a taser or a conducted electricity unit, right? But then realize, that's not enough, I better get my gun out, based on the threat that they perceive, right?
Yes.
Or vice versa, they may have their gun drawn, realize that's too much force, put it away, and take out a different tool that they have, right?
Yes.
So officers are constantly assessing and reassessing a situation based upon the information as it comes to them. Agreed?
Yes.
You were an officer for 27 years, I think you said. You've, I'm assuming arrested hundreds, if not thousands of individuals during your career.
Yes.
You've had to use force yourself.
Yes.
And would you agree with the general premise that the use of force is not necessarily attractive?
Yes.
Sometimes officers have to do very violent things. Agreed?
Yes.
It's a dangerous job.
Correct.
Have you ever heard the term hold for EMS? An officer says, I held him for EMS.
Not familiar with that.
Okay. So if you are involved in a use of force situation and an officer calls for medics, right?
So you just made that term up?
And I'm going to strike that. An officer decides to use the maximal restraint or the hobble, right? But
he didn't use the hobble because he wasn't fighting.
Would it be consistent
He was only in
with
cuffs.
the critical decision-making policy to say, I'm not going to hobble this person because I know EMS is on the way? Objection, Your Honor.
EMS wasn't on the way.
All right, while they're in this sidebar, let's go back to Bakari Sellers to explain what's going on. Bakari, another apparent legal dispute between the prosecution and the defense.
Yeah, the prosecution is doing its yeoman's work here with this report, attempting to show, and that's what we're seeing when you go through this report, you're attempting to show what should have been done. The fact that the knee should have been coming off the neck, that they should have allowed George Floyd to be detained, but to get up, there should have been this usage of force should have stopped at that time. And what you're seeing is the defense is now going back and attempting to pick apart that report. This report is very important because this is an expert opinion saying how the police should have behaved. And what this report says is that Derek Chauvin's behavior was inappropriate under the circumstances and that the use of force should have stopped. And so you're seeing this back and forth, and many times this back and forth is done outside of the jury's purview, and I think they're going right back now.
Yeah, let's listen in.
Was engaged in a struggle with a suspect and decided to use the maximal restraint technique. But then the suspect had a medical emergency. Would it be common for the officer to decide, I'm not going to use the maximal restraint technique at this point. I'm going to hold this suspect in place until EMS gets here?
Objection calls for speculation. So your scenario is an officer's planning to use the hobble and hasn't put it on yet, and then the suspect has a medical emergency, and then they decide not to use it, just hold them?
They weren't going to hobble him.
Yes.
He wasn't fighting.
When a maximal restraint technique is applied, the suspect is essentially handcuffed behind their back, and through a series of belts, their legs are bent at kind of an upward angle and then connected to some sort of device right around the waist.
He wasn't fighting, he wasn't thrashing, he wasn't twisting, he wasn't kicking.
Right. So, but there's a tie between the ankles
The only
and the waist.
thing he did
Correct.
Right?
while they held him down was say, I can't
EMS
breathe.
is on their way, the restraint,
You are reaching,
gotta take that
asshole.
off and can delay medical care. Agreed?
You're saying I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
If an officer uses the maximal restraint technique and EMS has to come, the officers have to remove that potentially, right?
Correct.
And that can delay medical treatment.
Sure.
The man was unconscious. You could have got the fuck up off of him. He was unconscious.
Now again,
When EMS
in
got
your
there,
27
you could have
years as a
gotten it.
police officer,
He was still
have you
handcuffed.
had to deal with
He was no threat to
crowds of
EMS.
people that form and watch your activity?
Yes.
In your experience as a police officer, especially in the more recent era, have you been in a situation where bystanders begin to film you and your activities?
Yes.
Does that happen more and more these days than it did 5 years ago?
Yes.
And have you been in a situation in your career as a law enforcement officer where the crowd starts to yell at you
Yes.
or becomes a little more volatile?
Yes.
As an officer, does that cause you concern?
Yes.
Generally speaking, as an officer with 27 years of experience, if you're dealing with one potential suspect and then a new perceived threat emerges, but you know that person needs medical attention,
There was
Do
no
you
new
deal with
perceived
the
threat.
medical attention and ignore the threat, or do you deal with the threat and then deal with the medical attention?
I guess you'd have to deal with both kind of simultaneously.
And that depends on the circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
So for example, if you were in a gun battle and someone was shooting at you and someone went into cardiac arrest, would you stop what you were doing to mitigate the threat, or in order to immediately perform CPR?
I'd
Or would you
mitigate,
continue with the threat?
I'd mitigate that threat to me.
Again, there was no other threat. There wasn't anyone
You've
else who
gone
was
through
a
all of the
threat.
standard training of the
The
Minneapolis Police
12
Department.
bystanders weren't
Yes.
a threat. And the man was
You had to deal with
Dead.
suspects who've been rendered unconscious.
Occasionally,
You're aware that the Minneapolis Police Department, where the training indicates that you need to be careful because when someone comes back out of unconsciousness, they can become more volatile than they were before.
that can happen, yes.
sometimes, not all the time.
You were asked a series of questions about
If that's the
what
case,
you-
people
about the
unconscious from
sergeant's,
surgery could wake up
use of
combative.
force review, right? A force review.
Yes,
And in a force review, there are certain things that you're required to do, correct?
yes,
That would include having a conversation with the involved officer, right?
right,
That would involve potentially having a conversation with the suspect upon whom force was used, agreed?
yes,
Review of the body
Couldn't do
worn
it, he was
camera,
deceased.
right?
yes,
Review of any other evidence that may exist, such as witness statements, photographs, phone
Most of
records,
which
whatever
you
it
didn't
needs
do
to
at the
assist,
time.
right?
yes,
It's not a huge, very thorough investigation. It's kind of a cursory look, right?
correct,
And again, you really
but there's
didn't
more
do
to it
that.
than simply watching a body-worn camera, right?
yes,
In this particular case, when you arrived on scene, you initially spoke with officers King and Lane.
With the
And
other
Mr.
two
Chauvin
present,
was present in that scene.
yes,
not the way it's
And
supposed
he
to be
was
done.
listening as Officer King and Lane told you what had just happened.
yes,
Now, when, in your experience as a police officer, when a supervisor's use of force, strike that. When one group of officers goes to a scene and a second shows up to assist, whose arrest is that? Is it the original officer or the assisting officers?
should be the original officer.
And so when you're reviewing a circumstance, would it be your policy to talk to the arresting officers or the assisting officers first to find out what happened?
I guess I wouldn't care one way or the other, whoever wants to tell me the story.
Okay. And if one officer is responsible for it, you're going to go to that officer, right?
Right,
And if two officers, you're going to ask them both.
correct,
And if all of the officers are standing around and they're talking about it, that's what you need to do initially, right?
correct,
Now, you were discussing again in this particular incident, when you arrived on scene, you asked, you kind of gave some direction to these officers, right?
yes,
And at the point that you arrived on scene, you knew it was a use of force incident, but it was not what you call a critical incident, agreed?
agreed,
Because at that point, Mr. Floyd, to the best of your knowledge, was still alive.
right.
If you know what the answer to that is.
One more time, sir?
At the point that you were initially on scene, you had no information that Mr. Floyd was deceased, right?
Correct,
Now, you then instructed the officers to do a few things, right? Potentially talk to witnesses, and then two officers to go down to the hospital with you
Yes.
in their squad car.
yes,
All right. And we saw this video where you instructed Officer Chauvin to try to get some witness statements, things of that nature, right?
Yes,
And he made the comment that he would try, but the crowd seemed pretty hostile.
yes,
Officer Chauvin and Officer Tao ended up at the hospital with you,
they did.
and Officer King and Officer Lane remained on scene, right?
Yes,
At some point when you learned that Mr. Floyd had died, the use of force review was no longer reviewed by you, correct?
correct.
Someone died, well, and I believe even per policy, if someone was, a use of force occurred while someone was in handcuffs, that policy required you to reach out to your superiors, right?
That's correct.
And if Mr. Floyd had not died, you would have not conducted a use of force review, correct?
Correct.
You would have left it to the higher ups, the people up the chain of command.
Right, since he sustained an injury in handcuffs.
And likewise, when a suspect dies in police custody, you don't do a use of force review.
Right,
And you did not do a use of force review in this case, did you?
no,
Now, you talked about when it became a critical incident, the officers ended up at room 100 down at City Hall. I think you initially said it was a courthouse, but you're talking about City Hall across the street.
yes, I said it wrong.
And that's a room that's maintained by the Minneapolis Police Administration, right?
Right,
That's where any involved officers go during a critical incident.
right,
Or officers who are involved or potentially witnesses to a critical incident.
correct.
And you understand that the 4 involved officers were each individually transported to room 100, right?
I believe that was the case.
And you referenced that at that point, kind of the critical incident policy takes over and certain things have to happen pursuant to the critical incident policy, right?
Yes,
A whole host of things have to happen, right?
yes,
You referenced interviews of officers. You have no idea if interviews of officers occurred in room 100 on or about May 25th, 2020 or May 26th of 2020.
I'm not positive, no.
That's one thing that could potentially happen, right?
Yes,
But not necessarily.
right,
Now, you testified that kind of at the end of the night, Officer Lane, or while the end of your involvement, Officer Lane handed you a couple of pieces of evidence that pertained to the arrest back at 38th in Chicago, right?
correct.
Or the incident at 38th in Chicago, right?
Yes,
Do you recall what those items were?
I recall one for sure was a slip of paper with a name from one of the parties in the vehicle that he'd gotten.
Okay. Do you recall the other being an identification card?
I think so.
And do you remember the name of the person that was on the slip of paper?
I don't.
Would it refresh your recollection to review your report that you drafted that night?
Yes,
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? Does that refresh your recollection?
yes.
What was the name on the piece of paper? Shawanda Hill?
Shawnee Hill.
And the other item that he handed you was an Minnesota identification card, correct?
Correct.
With the name of William Smythe.
Yes,
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
You're right, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, you were asked whether you agree with the proposition that sometimes police officers have to do violent things, and you agree with that, correct?
Yes,
But sometimes police officers should not do violent things, isn't that right?
yes,
You were asked about the critical thinking model that's used and adopted by the Minneapolis Police Department, correct?
correct.
And that's a model that requires officers to continually take in information, evaluate it, reevaluate it, reassess, and if necessary, adjust their conduct, correct?
Yes,
And as you stated under questioning by defense counsel, sometimes the information they're taking in would cause the officer to need to take more drastic measures, fair?
yes,
But sometimes the information that the officer would take in would cause them to need to reevaluate what they're doing and use less drastic measures, correct?
yes,
Some of the information that might be relevant is whether or not the subject is resisting, correct?
could you say that one more?
One of the pieces of the information the officer may need to take in and evaluate is whether the subject is resisting, correct?
Yes,
And if the subject is not resisting, there is no longer a need to continue to restrain them, correct?
yes,
And other information that might be helpful in making an assessment is to determine whether or not the subject is continuing to breathe, correct?
yes.
Yeah, it is leading to this point, Mr. Sheriff, if you would rephrase.
Would it be important for
Response was stricken.
would it be reasonable then in the critical thinking model for an officer to determine and take in information about the subject's medical condition?
Yes,
For example, if the subject is no longer breathing, would it be important for the officer to take that into account to reassess and reevaluate what they're doing?
yes,
Or if the subject no longer has a pulse, for example, would that be important information in the critical thinking model for the officer to take in, consider, and decide to maybe take a different step?
yes,
And in such a case, would it be possible then that the officer would not need to do something violent, but would need to do something less violent,
yes,
like render medical assistance?
yes,
You were asked about a threat assessment, is that right?
yes,
And you were asked about an example of whether an officer would perceive a threat if there was a gun battle and need to make a determination between medical attention and that kind of extreme threat, right?
yes.
You reviewed the body-worn cameras, correct?
I've reviewed body-worn camera footage.
You didn't see a gun battle?
No,
Nothing further.
So the critical decision-making model requires the officers to take in multiple pieces of information and decide how to act based on the circumstances, right?
yes,
Other factors they may consider is the size of the crowd, right?
yes,
Their tactical position,
It was a very
Yes.
small crowd.
traffic,
Most of those people were women.
rendering
They
medical
weren't
aid
very
to a
big.
person in the middle of a busy
was, what,
street
12
where
to
buses
14
and cars
people?
are turning. That may not be the best decision for an officer to make.
right,
Rendering medical aid or while trying to deal with other people who are upset with you or volatile towards you may come into play. Agreed?
Yes,
Except they weren't in the way. And
An
they actually
officer
weren't
who
volatile.
is essentially in a tactical disadvantage
You had one
that'll
cop
come into play.
yes.
keeping them under control and on the
Officers have to
sidewalk.
look
So at
at
no time did
lots
he
of
feel
different
threatened
bits
by
of
them.
information and decide how to proceed based on the totality of the circumstances and not just one single fact. Agreed?
Yes.
No further questions.
Nothing further? Sheriff?
And an officer needs to consider whether other sources of information might be relevant to the need to render medical aid, correct?
Yes.
Including people telling the officer that a person was in need of medical assistance. That might be important for them to consider.
Sure.
And if somebody's communicating this in a desperate fashion, that doesn't necessarily constitute a threat to the officer, does it?
Sustained.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Sergeant. You may step down.
Thank you, sir.
All right, members of the jury, we're going to adjourn for the day. We'll try and